Okay, so we'll circle back a little tomorrow about just another final piece on the surrender in Germany, but we'll push ahead a little bit today. So the surrender in Germany, as we saw, took place in May. Overall, though, while there's great euphoria across the United States, it is a little bit tempered with the fact that Franklin Roosevelt had died the previous month in April. Roosevelt had started to exhibit some health troubles in August of 44. He had some serious chest pains while he was delivering his speech in Washington State. The doctors held the seriousness of Roosevelt's conditions, not only from the public, but also from those closest to him. Almost no one really knew his blood pressure had risen as high as 260 over 150, which is extremely dangerous. Woodrow Wilson's widow, Edith, had told Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins that he looks exactly as my husband did when he went into his decline. So Edith was recognizing the symptoms of Roosevelt's downturn soon. And so Roosevelt is resting in Warm Springs, Georgia, which was his retreat. He went there for the mineral springs for his poliomyelitis. And he was sitting in the living room with his secretary, Lucy Mercer, with whom he had restarted his extramarital affair. He was with two cousins and his dog Svala, while the artist Elizabeth Shumatov was painting his portrait. According to his presidential biographer, Doris Kearns Goodwin, it was about 1 p.m. when the president suddenly complained of a terrific pain in the back of his head and then collapsed unconscious. One of the women that was there summoned a doctor who immediately recognized the symptoms of a massive cerebral hemorrhage and gave the president a shot of adrenaline into his heart in a vain attempt to revive him. Mercer and the artist quickly left the house, expecting FDR's family to arrive as soon as word got out. Another doctor phoned the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, in D.C., informing her that FDR had fainted. She told the doctor she would travel to Georgia that evening after a scheduled speaking engagement, but by 3:30, doctors in Warm Springs had pronounced the president dead. Eleanor delivered her speech that afternoon and was listening to a piano performance when she was summoned back to the White House. In her memoirs, she recalled that the ride to the White House was one of dread, as she knew in her heart that Franklin had died. Once in her sitting room, aides told her of the president's death. The couple's daughter, Anna, arrived and the women changed into black dresses. Eleanor then phoned their 4 sons, all of whom were on active military duty. So obviously the world was stunned by Roosevelt's death. Churchill compared it to having been struck by a physical blow, and the United States and the world went into mourning. So Roosevelt's body was taken from Warm Springs in Georgia by train to D.C. for the funeral before his burial at home in Hyde Park, New York. And we see again that iconic image in the upper right-hand corner there of Graham Jackson playing as FDR leaves Warm Springs, Georgia for the last time. And you just see the emotion on his face as they're saying goodbye to the president. And here is Roosevelt's tomb in Hyde Park, New York. You can see it's both Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt. Anna's legal name was Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, but you can see both of their final resting place up there in Hyde Park. Currently, the country honors Roosevelt with a monument that opened in 1997, the FDR Memorial in D.C. It's a different memorial than the other ones we're familiar with. The Washington Monument is the monolith on the mall. The Jefferson Memorial is that rotunda you see in the distance there, and the Lincoln Memorial is the big colonnade. Roosevelt's memorial is very different. It's a flowing landscape of architecture, and it's designed to kind of travel through the years of Roosevelt's administration. So it begins on one end of the plaza. Here, I believe it is, you kind of make your way through, and as you're going through this, you're seeing various scenes of his presidency with the Great Depression and World War II. And we see, that's one of the entrances there. Flowing water is one of those. Again, water is a sign of hope and sign of life, so that kind of cascades all through the monument. And there's a pervasive sense there with statues of him. That's with his beloved dog Fala there, and piece of his speeches, piece of his radio address, pieces of his writings are all featured through it. So Roosevelt then goes on, and he's buried, and we still reflect on his legacy to this day as one of the most consequential presidents in American history. That flow, again, country doesn't stop, and the new president takes over. And that new president is Harry Truman. Truman was born and raised in Missouri. He attended a college before he started work as a young man. He was a college dropout, the last president to be so. While he was living in Independence, Missouri, he served as a Shabbos goy for Jewish neighbors, which means that he had Jewish neighbors living next door. And on the Sabbath, on Saturdays, there was work that the Jewish family could not do, and they would hire out Truman to do that. So Truman had, from a very early age, had experience with Jewish people, which again, we're not going to get to the time in the class, kind of helped shape his viewpoint along with the Holocaust and World War II, but certainly his view in helping then to foster the creation of the modern state of Israel. Truman served in World War I after cheating on his vision test. So Truman's vision was so bad that he initially failed the vision test, but then he went and just memorized the vision test word letters, and he was able to pass it then and get into the war. And that war experience transformed him into just a simple farm boy into a leader. After the war, he returned back to Missouri to serve there. 1919, he married his wife, Bess Truman. He then opened a men's clothing store, which then failed, so he was not as successful with his business. Again, another president sort of similar to Ulysses Grant, who tried to open a store but wasn't all this successful. Truman's going to have that same experience. Luckily, he was kind of supported by his friends. He was able to serve as a county judge. And as that role, he was helped by a powerful political machine led by Tom Pendergast. Again, we're not going to have time to get all of that, but we'll talk about it later. 1934, he was elected as the United States Senator from Missouri, and during that time that he was serving in the Senate, he headed a committee that went after waste in the war. So he was familiar with war operations from that perspective of knowing some of the details of how supplies were brought and how industry worked. There's other secrets that he's not going to know about that'll shape his post-war presidency. And then in 1945, as we talked about yesterday, he became the vice president under Roosevelt. So how does Truman find out about Roosevelt's death? Truman was up on Capitol Hill playing cards with his friends in Congress when he was told that the White House press secretary wanted to speak with him. Truman dialed the number and announced himself, and then the others in the room noticed that all of the color completely left his face. Jesus Christ and General Jackson, he said as he hung up the phone, and without saying another word, Truman ran through the Capitol to get to the White House as quickly as he could. He arrived at the White House at 5:30, where he was greeted by the former First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, who had informed him, Harry, the president, is dead. He asked Eleanor if there was anything he could do for her, to which she replied, is there anything we can do for you? You are the one in trouble now. So recognizing again the tremendous pressure that had been placed on who had been relatively a simple, humble guy from Independence, Missouri in the Senate. Now he's been catapulted to President of the United States at the end of a war. Here's a quote from Harry Truman on the next day after he met with the White House press corps. Speaking to the White House press corps, boys, if you ever pray for me now. I don't know if you fellows ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when they told me what had happened yesterday, I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me. And the reason for this, again, is Roosevelt kept things very close to his chest. Roosevelt didn't engage in a lot with, except for very few close aides. He didn't tell what the war plans were going to be, what his plans for the post-war vision were going to be. He kept that among himself and very close advisors. Truman was not one of those close friends. As a matter of fact, on January 22nd, 1945, 2 days after Inauguration Day, when he has his new vice president, Roosevelt sent Truman a note saying to limit his communications with Truman to only absolutely urgent items. So again, kind of even don't bother me to his vice president. Kind of showing again the power and the level of force that Roosevelt had. The next day, there was an aide was sitting in the East Room of the White House for the first day of Truman's on the job as president. Out of custom, everyone stood in the East Room and Mrs. Roosevelt entered, but no one stood a few minutes later when Harry Truman, who was the new president of the United States. The aide noted that the White House staff did not intend disrespect. The aide said Harry Truman was not yet felt by those to be president, so great was the hold in their minds of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. At this time, though, there's no mechanism for replacing the vice president. So when Truman rises up to become president, there's nobody that can be taking the place of vice president. So if something would have happened to Truman, the Secretary of State would have become the president. As we see from that earlier quote, Truman sensed that enormous pressure had been placed on him, which was obviously true. He was vice president for less than 3 months. He was not really in the loop on major wartime strategy or diplomatic measures. And decisions about the post-war world have been made at earlier conferences like Casablanca and Cairo and Tehran. And there's another conference that took place at Yalta in the Soviet Union. And we're going to talk about that right now. The Yalta Conference was codenamed Argonaut, and that took place from February 4th to the 11th of 1945. This was the final meeting among Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, and you can see again that picture. There's Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin sitting there in the palace at Yalta. De Gaulle, who projected himself to be the leader of the Free French, he was not invited, so he felt slighted by this meeting. Yalta, though, had been preceded, we're going to talk about this conference briefly, had been preceded by another conference called the Moscow Conference, which took place in October of 1944. That conference, though, was only a meeting between Churchill and Stalin. Roosevelt had not made his way there. It was the presidential campaign, also going all the way to Moscow. Roosevelt was not going to do that, but Churchill informed Roosevelt what had taken place. At this time, Churchill had made a secret proposal on a scrap of paper to divide Europe into Western and Soviet spheres of influence. So not that they would necessarily take them over, but where they would kind of have more influence on the different parts. And we see that transcription here, this napkin, as it's called, the scrap of paper, and you see Churchill's writing on the right. And then the transcription on the left there, with Romania being primarily Russia, Greece being primarily falling under the Great Britain, Yugoslavia and Hungary kind of being split between the two, Bulgaria kind of falling under the control of Russia. So Stalin looked at the paper, pondered it for a moment, and then you see in this upper right-hand corner here this check mark. That check mark came from Stalin, who handed it back to Churchill. Churchill commented, might it not be thought rather cynical if it seemed we had disposed of such issues so faithful to millions of people in such an offhand manner? Let us burn the paper. Stalin counseled, however, to save the historic scrap of paper. Churchill called the scrap of paper a naughty document, which came to be known as the Percentages Agreement. This was a significant consequence of the agreement was the Cold War, according to a historian, because of the pre-war imperialist thought of Churchill and Stalin. So again, being able to just kind of divide pieces between spheres of influence contributed to the Cold War, because it removed the free choice of the people of Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean from choosing their own pathway after the occupation of the Nazis. So that just kind of lays the groundwork a little bit for Yalta. So we see this happening here. Roosevelt had wanted a Big Three meeting before 1944 in a neutral location, but Stalin, though, blaming his doctors, wanted it to be held in the Crimea. Roosevelt was technically the host of this meeting. The Americans were held in the American villa there, and Roosevelt, as you saw in the earlier picture, sat in the center seat in the photographs. Each leader, though, had his own agenda for the conference. The percentages was never mentioned at Yalta or at other meetings. So that percentage agreement that Churchill and Stalin had kind of reached never really officially comes up at any of the Yalta Potsdam conferences later on, but it's there in the back of both of the leaders' minds as they're shaping the Cold War. So we got to look at the goals of each of these leaders. So Roosevelt's goals at Yalta were very simply that he wanted the Soviet support in the Pacific War. He was seeking to make sure that the Soviet Union would enter the war against the Japanese when it came time, and he also wanted Soviet participation in the United Nations. That organization would be a peacekeeping organization. He saw the legacy of the League of Nations when the United States did not participate in the League, and the lack of enforcement the League had. He does not want to repeat that mistake by having the Soviet Union not participate in the League. Churchill is going to be advocating for free and democratic governments in Central and Eastern Europe, which again is kind of odd given that he had talked to Stalin about kind of spheres of influence. But again, spheres of influence doesn't mean that they run the show. It just means that he recognized that Stalin's going to have a little bit of a role in places like Hungary and Romania, but at the same time, the people should have fair and free governmental choices there. And for Stalin and for Churchill, Poland was kind of a key location because Poland was the trigger that brought the Great Britain and France into the war. Stalin is obviously looking for the Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern and Central Europe, kind of basically running the shots there, because he again viewed that as key for national security. Again, that for how many, two previous wars with the Napoleon and the French forces invading through Germany into Poland, into Russia, Germany again attacking through Poland into Russia in both World War I and World War II. He now wants to make sure he has a secure western border. So let's talk about what happened there. Poland was first on Stalin's list to deal with because, again, Poland was that avenue of attack used against the Soviets. So the Russians, who are historically, the Russians had greatly sinned against Poland, so they needed to make up for that. That was their argument, and so what they wanted was a mighty, free, and independent Poland. The Soviets, again, we talked about this before, they would keep the eastern part of Poland that they took in 1945 and give the Poles German lands in the west. They would shift Poland from the east to the west, and in doing so, they would kind of get their buffer security that they wanted on their western border. They also promised free elections, despite the fact that they had a puppet regime installed in Poland at the time. Going to kind of the playoff on this is Roosevelt wants the Soviets to join the war in the Pacific. We were preparing for a land invasion of the home islands potentially at the end of 45, and Roosevelt seeing that would take a massive number of American troops, so it would be a massive number of American casualties. So how do we help alleviate some of that? By having the Allies join us. So Soviet participation in that would be significant. It would end the war sooner and would reduce the American deaths and wounding and wounds. Before joining the war, though, the Soviet Union wanted the U.S. to recognize the independence of Mongolia from China. Now, Mongolia had been existing as a puppet state of the Soviet Union since 1924, and that was one of the conditions for their efforts there. The Soviets also wanted that their interest in Chinese railroad and in Port Arthur, which was along the western coast, the eastern coast of the Soviet Union on the Pacific Ocean there. The Big Three agreed to Stalin's demands of the railroad and the access to Port Arthur without even asking China. So again, that kind of viewpoint of we're calling the shots, China will have to live with that. Stalin also wanted the return of South Sakhalin and control of the Kuril Islands. So we see here on this map, Sakhalin was an island. The yellow part belongs to the Soviet Union, and the pink part was part of Japan. That island had been split in the Sino-Japanese War of 1905. The Soviets wanted it all back the Russo-Japanese War. They wanted it all back, returned to them, and that's going to be one of their conditions. Britain and the United States agreed to that, and so the Soviets will pledge to enter the war in the Pacific 3 months after they defeat the Germans. Now remember, Yalta is taking place in February. We don't know exactly when the war is going to end. They don't know in February if the war will be over by May. They just know that 3 months after the conclusion of the war, the Soviets will join the war efforts in the Pacific against Japan. The Soviets also agreed to participate in the United Nations, which pleased Roosevelt to no end. And the piece for that is because of the permanent members of the Security Councils that would have been the United States, Britain, France, and Germany would have a veto power in the Security Council, and the Soviet Union was very excited about that, being able to kind of control the world body there. Stalin, though, was a little bit ambitious in asking for all 16 republics that make up the Soviet Union to have a seat, but 14 of them were denied seats in the United Nations at that time. Okay, with that discussion settled, they're now going to talk about Germany. And so the issues here, again, is they're going to reinforce the idea of unconditional surrender. So again, no conditions for German surrender. There will be no tolerance of anything that Germany is asking for. They will have to just surrender totally and completely to them. Germany will undergo complete demilitarization, removing all armed forces, and they will also undergo a process of denazification. So they'll remove any of the symbols of Nazi power that will go after the Nazi leadership and remove them from any kind of leadership in the future. War reparations will be paid through forced labor, rebuilding what was destroyed. So we're not going to do it necessarily through funds, but we're going to use people to go to the Soviet Union to rebuild what was destroyed in the country. They decided they would hunt down Nazi war criminals, and they would put them on trial in the nation where the crimes were committed. So it wasn't there to be tried in the neutral nations, but they would try to be where the crimes were committed, and the Nazi leadership would be excluded. Okay, how Germany would stand after the war would be decided through a European Advisory Commission and the Committee on the Dismemberment of Germany. So they would try to decide how that would work. They would set boundaries for the post-war occupation zones for Germany, so what areas the Allies would kind of occupy and oversee the demilitarization, the denazification would be decided by this broad European Advisory Commission. There would be 3 zones, with one for each of the big 3, so the United States, the British, and the Soviets would all have a zone of occupation. France would be allowed to get a zone of occupation, but it would need to come from the British and the American zones. So the Americans and the British would have to give up part of their territory that they were going to occupy and give that to the French if the French were going to have that. And ultimately, this group would decide if Germany would be divided into several nations. They're not thinking of East and West Germany at the time, so we got to kind of remove that from our mindset. East and West Germany is a construct because of the Cold War that breaks after the Soviet Union. At the time, that was not the idea. The idea was more what we see here from Churchill. Churchill was envisioning that there would be three states, kind of divided geographically north and south, and with a West German state, which is bordering France. But the reason for this north-south division is kind of more cultural and religious. So northern Germany tends to be more Protestant, while southern Germany tends to be more Catholic. So we're dividing it religiously. The other plan here was a 5-division proposal that was laid out by the U.S. Secretary of Treasury, Harry Morgenthau Jr., where you would take it and divide it into 5 different countries. That one didn't get much traction because it was totally punitive, and people saw very quickly that 5 states was not going to be a winning strategy for the end of the war here. All right, so we see here in this that of the goals, we can kind of go through quickly. So we see that Roosevelt got the Pacific War. He got the Soviet Union to participate in the United Nations. Stalin's going to be able to kind of have that sphere of influence in Eastern and Central Europe and Poland particularly, and as the national security. So the question comes down to, what does Churchill get in terms of the free elections with democratic governments in Central and Eastern Europe? So this breaks out into the Declaration of Liberated Europe. And what the Declaration of Liberated Europe said, that Europeans could create democratic institutions of their own choice with the earliest possible establishment through free elections, governments responsive to the will of the people. So the free people, those who had just been liberated from the Nazis, would be able to set up governments through free and fair elections. In the Declaration, it was also that the big three, the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States, would consult together on measures necessary to discharge the joint responsibilities. So those 3 countries worked together to make sure these pieces would happen. Unfortunately, those we know, those were more words than real impact, especially for the people of Poland. The Declaration gave credence to the Lublin government, the government that the communists had installed, the Soviets had installed in the eastern part. It would be a short-term peace, but you had an overall pro-Soviet government acting in Poland. And Stalin could use that vague language to place emphasis on the pro-Soviet government than on the Polish government in exile, which was much more democratic than the pro-Soviet government. And so when the war concluded, the communist government, the Lublin government, was established, which created feelings of betrayal among the Poles towards Western allies. And many soldiers actually refused to return to Poland for fear of repression by the Soviets. And so many of them were allowed to settle in Britain and other parts of Western Europe, simply because they were worried they'd be sent back to sent back to Poland, which again controlled by the communists and subject to some of the death threats, not just the death threats, but the executions that some of the officers had faced in earlier times. So we're now at the end of that. We're going to jump back to the Pacific campaign tomorrow and get through a good portion of that and finish up that tomorrow. So have a good rest of your day.